What's the difference between lying and not telling the truth? Well, in a lot of ways, the world of voice teachers and of singing is the perfect laboratory for exploring this question. That's because every voice teacher has one tool in their toolbox that's more powerful than all the others. And that's the confidence that they give the student so that they can get up tomorrow and practice their singing. Singing's a weird thing. You can't see what's going on. Sometimes you can't tell if you're making progress or not. And it's all wrapped up in our confidence. If you think about what happens to your voice when you're not feeling confident, it doesn't sound the same as a really confident guy. And sometimes even when someone sounds like a confident guy, it's a little bit off. And we know that they're not really confident. We can tell that they're not telling the truth. We all have, everyone who helps people with their singing, a temptation to stretch the truth a little bit, because we want you to be confident. And if that means telling a little white lie, that might be something that we feel is for the greater good. It benefits you. There is a point, though, where this kind of thing crosses the line into fraud. And what is that line? Well, I'm not sure I can give a definite answer, but I'm sure I can give a definite example.
Right. And what I love about the Swedish-Italian school is it's been proven over many years to be not only helpful in helping someone develop their voice, but also therapeutically. Been proven therapeutically.
Let's think for a second about what the truth actually is. Now, this is a question that philosophers have been working on for a long time, and they will probably work on it forever. So I'm just going to stick with a really simple classic definition of the truth. It's when what you say lines up with the facts, with objective reality. Now, if I don't tell the truth, that just means that what I said doesn't line up with the facts. It doesn't mean that I'm lying. Lying is a whole different thing. Lying is when I do that on purpose. When I know what I'm doing, and I know that it's not true. I know that what I'm saying doesn't line up with the facts, and I say it anyway. Now, if I'm selling something, I might stretch the truth a little bit, or I might embellish. And I might use language that isn't necessarily untrue, in the sense that it doesn't violate any facts. So I might be stretching a sort of opinion. I might be exaggerating how I feel about something. And nobody can really say, well, you got the facts wrong. You see this in advertisements all the time. So how is that different from fraud? Well, fraud is when I tell you something is a fact, and I'm selling you something based on those facts, based on that truth, as I put it. And I know that actually it doesn't line up with the facts. We're now in the summer of 2020. In the summer of 2019, I went on a little mission to explore whether or not the Swedish-Italian school of singing was telling the truth when they talk about where their method comes from. They make a really big deal about all the famous figures from history who eventually contribute to this method. They call it a lineage. It's like a family tree.
And here was this great man who had studied with Enrico Caruso and all the great teachers of the Italian school. He had also studied with UC Bierling's teacher and one of Kirsten Flagstadt's teachers. So there was a very long lineage behind this training.
It's a little bit like the king passing on his nobility to his heirs. And if the claims that they make about their history are true, well, that's a pretty big deal, because they're the keepers then of a tradition. And anyone who's after the sound that we hear when we listen to recordings from the 1950s, all these great old opera singers, in particular the ones they name, like Birgit Nilsson and Jussi Björling and Kirsten Flagstad. Well, these figures, if we want to sound like them, then we should study what they studied. Shouldn't we go after the teachers who know how to do what they were doing and can show us? It really makes sense, right? So if these claims are true, it's really worth preserving and studying these methods. Now, when I got interested in this, I wasn't a stranger to the Swedish-Italian school of singing. In fact, the leader of their group, almost a cult, I would call it, is named David L. Jones, and he was my last voice teacher. Now, I didn't have a bad experience with David Jones. After I left, I thought still he was the most generous and kind man on the planet, and I thought he was a genius, and I thought he was really helping me become a great singer. So why did I stop taking lessons with David Jones? Well, I ran out of money. And I ran out of money because I stopped getting work as a singer. And I stopped getting work as a singer, not for random reasons. I remember going to the Metropolitan Opera for our coaching because they were hiring me to do things. And I was warned that my singing was getting really bad. And when they asked who I was taking lessons from or coaching with, I named David Jones. And they said, well, then, you need to think about that and maybe make better choices about who you're taking advice from because your singing's getting really bad. That was my last time working at the Metropolitan Opera. They never asked me to come back again. And I can't blame them. Honestly, I wasn't producing the kind of singing that's good enough to present on their stage. And a big reason for it was I was doing exactly what David Jones told me to do. So what is this Swedish-Italian business? Well, it's a school that was supposed to have been handed down to the Swedes from Italy, from this guy named Lamperti. And Lamperti was supposed to have somehow taught some people who took the method back to Sweden, and Manuel Garcia as well, and Sigmund Freud. So when you try to figure out where this stuff actually comes from, it's a laundry list of famous people, basically. And you can't find any real historical documentation for any of it, except for one guy. There's a researcher cited in David Jones's book on the Swedish-Italian method. His name is Leif Lundberg. And when I wanted to explore this further, I did the obvious thing that apparently no one had ever done before. I picked up the phone and I called Leif Lundberg. Well, actually, I used my computer because that's what we do now. But we still like to say I picked up. I just like the way the expression goes.
Sweden has exported a lot of singers within the Bulgarian repertoire and the dramatic repertoire, German ones. And the last 20, 25 years, I've been working with more or less all the Swedes that have done that successfully, either domestic or international, in different ways.
And he was the only person named in David Jones's book as an authority on the subject. Actually, I contacted David and I told him, we are on the record now. Can you tell me if Leif Lundberg is really an authority on this? And David Jones told me, yes, he is the ultimate authority. Now, I have to admit, I was a little bit sneaky because I had started to smell what was going on here. And I was suspecting that David Jones was actually lying his face off to the whole world. So what I did, which is not lying, but also not telling the whole truth, was I kind of acted like I didn't like what Leif Lundberg had to say. I didn't say that in so many words, but I acted like Leif Lundberg was not someone I appreciated, like I was questioning what he had told me. David Jones pounced on this and started assuring me that Leif Lundberg is the ultimate authority on all of this stuff. Little did David know I had already spoken with Leif Lundberg, and Leif Lundberg had told me that all of this was fairy tales. So David was a little bit trapped. At this point, he had made a couple of huge mistakes. One, he published an actual source. He published a source that he didn't think anyone could get in touch with. But little did he know, elderly people can use Skype. And so I Skyped Leif Lundberg, and I started to interact with him, and I asked him, can we do an interview maybe? So what happened next was really interesting. David Jones spent hours and hours trying to convince me that all of this stuff actually was true. And in the end, he staked his claim on his own singing. And so I asked, can I see an example of your own singing? And that's when he suddenly had to go. And that's when I knew I was really on to something. So I did a series of interviews here on my channel with Leif Lundberg. Now these are some of my early videos. The sound is really bad. We were on Skype and I just recorded the call and kind of tried to edit that into something. And it's sometimes hard to understand what he's saying, but it is very clear what he is saying. Basically, none of these stories are true. They're not a little bit exaggerated. David was caught with his pants on fire, just completely lying. And the whole history of the Swedish-Italian school turned out to be a fraud perpetuated to keep these lessons going, to keep the money flowing. That was already a bad thing, and I expected this to probably blow up into some kind of drama. Instead, silence. This was a very interesting thing to see happen. All of a sudden, a lot of places where I had been welcome before, I was suddenly unwelcome. I was banned from social media groups that involve teachers discussing singing methods that seem like they're impartial places, forums where ideas can be freely exchanged. Not so much. And when I started to look into why, what I found was that a lot of times administrators in these groups were disciples of David Jones. And when I checked their websites, I would see that they were using the credibility of the Swedish-Italian school to sell their own lessons. And what I found was a vast network of Swedish-Italian teachers, all of them repeating the same fraudulent claims about the history of what they call the Swedish-Italian school. You can check those videos if you want to know all the details. They are very, very in-depth, and piece by piece, Leif Lundberg, that's the same Leif Lundberg you will find in David Jones's book, and the same Leif Lundberg who David claims is the ultimate authority on these matters, debunked the whole thing. Now, I still have an open offer for anyone who actually believes in the stories of the Swedish-Italian school to come and rebut everything I've been saying, to prove me wrong. No one has been able to come forward, and that's very interesting. They have a lot to lose if people start talking about how ridiculous these stories are. So you'd think that they would come up with some kind of facts, some kind of evidence to show that they're telling the truth. Now that leaves us with two options. Either they're lying, or they have never bothered to actually check if everything that they've built their reputations on is actually true. I'm not sure which one of those is worse. Not telling the truth because you're deliberately lying, or not telling the truth about your area of expertise because you never bothered to actually look into the history, even though you're teaching it. There is a sort of nuanced third option for what's going on with these people, and that's cognitive dissonance. I was debating with a voice teacher named Alexandra Eng, who is also a disciple of David Jones. And I noticed some rather disingenuous behavior that I recognized because I had done it myself when I was a student of David Jones. I had used the same kind of arguments to try to shut people down when they had some kind of question about the obvious lack of consistency in what I was saying. Now, Alexandra seems like a very good person to me, and you can find clips of her singing, and she's pretty great. So that's not saying that anyone who decides to study this method is going to be a bad singer. But it does start to make us wonder whether or not it actually matters what method you study. If these methods kind of all have the same result, no matter what's being taught in the studio, why are we going to voice teachers? It's possible to have, sort of in the back of your mind, the idea that you're lying, but in the front of your mind, you feel like you're telling the truth. That's called cognitive dissonance, and that's a very common thing. And I feel a little bit bad for the disciples of David Jones because I think a lot of them are good people and they're just really, really deep into this cognitive dissonance. They're not able to process the facts. They can't process the facts because the implications are really bad. The implications are they've not only been fooled, but that they've been participating in a system that actively works to deceive other people for profit. You can see in their behavior where they try to suppress the conversation, where they try to paint my videos about this subject as hateful. So hopefully you've realized by this point in this video that I don't hate anybody, and that asking for the truth isn't a form of hatred. And in the times we're living in, it's really, really not aged well, this accusation of hateful behavior, because we're living in a world that's really, really, really having a problem with hatred right now and is confronting real hatred. Now, an interesting thing about these words, the hateful videos, and my hateful campaign against David Jones, is that I see those same words used over and over again. And oftentimes when I dig into who is saying them, it turns out that they're connected to David Jones in some way. Either on their website, they're announcing that they're students of David Jones who are now teaching. So they're disciples and they're selling this Swedish-Italian mythology. I'm not sure that it's hateful to ask them to tell the truth, but I do realize it's very inconvenient and that they would like me to stop, and that they would like anyone who is thinking about watching these videos to be scared of me before they come in the door. At the very least, people who are presenting themselves as impartial arbiters in the world of voice teaching, moderators, administrators in groups, and people who are in trade organizations like the National Association of Teachers of Singing, if they are claiming to be impartial, then they should really disclose if they're part of this group, because this group has a history of actively lying. Now, I think if you're a disciple of David Jones and you're engaged in these practices of trying to suppress discussion of some very uncomfortable truths, some facts that happen to really put what you've been saying in a bad light, and that kind of make your authority very questionable, you need to disclose that. It's not ethical for you to be presenting yourself as an impartial judge when actually everything you do is dictated by your leader. Our community, that's teachers of singing and especially students of singing, the people who put food on your table, they really deserve some kind of explanation for this stuff. Why have you been selling, and why have you been staking your reputation on claims that you've never verified? And I know you've never verified them because I tried to. And not only could I not verify them, your own sources told me this stuff is absolute lies. We who are your colleagues, we who are your potential clients, deserve some kind of response. And I would go further and say that Leif Lundberg deserves an apology for being put in your book. You don't need this to be a valuable resource for people who are trying to learn how to sing. You could maybe think about how you're approaching the whole thing. So I invite you to explore what it is to be a teacher of singing. Why is it that you look for ways you can trap the student in your studio and make them believe that they need to come to this one and only place for the real singing, for the real knowledge, for the real tradition? If that's your case, you should probably quit teaching, because none of what you've been saying is true. Now, if, on the other hand, what you have to offer comes from inside of you, then maybe you don't need any of this. Maybe you can stand on your own 2 feet and you can stop lying to the world about where your knowledge comes from. If it comes from your own experience and you just kind of make things up as you go along, like I do, then it's okay. It's okay. You can just say that to your students. I know you're afraid that they're not going to stay with you, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe teaching voice and dating shouldn't look anything alike. So what am I asking you? Well, if you're part of the Swedish-Italian cult, nothing. There's really, I don't believe I can get through to you. I don't think there's much chance of that. This message is for all the teachers out there who have noticed. And I know you're out there because you send me messages and then you ask me not to tell anybody that we've had a conversation. You send me messages saying, yeah, I noticed this stuff, but you should just kind of quiet down. You're putting your career at risk. You're putting yourself at risk by speaking up. Well, this message is for you. You have a responsibility to say something. When you know someone is lying, and it's coming at the expense of students, of people whose careers are on the line, you have a responsibility to say, actually, I know for a fact that's not true. And if you're a student of singing, I want you to keep in mind that you also have some responsibility here. You have a responsibility to check. You have a responsibility to ask someone to show you what they mean when they explain a technique but you also have a responsibility to check if their claims about lineage, about history, and about anything else that could be factual is actually true. If you don't, you got the teachers you deserve.